Hi everyone, welcome to today's video. I'm Dre, the host and founder of the Dragon Network, and today I want to talk about workarounds. In particular, what you should do when you find one. Let's get started with my definition of what a workaround actually is. So I believe that a workaround is an alternative path to accomplishing a task or a series of tasks that differs from the designed and intended process. So if you Google workarounds, you're going to see all sorts of similar definitions that are out there. This is just one that I've created to help frame the term from the perspective of a healthcare IT professional. So let's get started. So when you first hear that a workaround is taking place, or you first stumble across a workaround as you're going about your regular work, there's a few different questions that you want to ask yourself to really understand what's going on before the group can have a discussion around whether or not the workaround is favorable or unfavorable. So the first question that you want to ask is the workflow or is the process that has the workaround in place something that has been defined already? And if it has been defined, has this been documented and has that process flow been communicated to the individuals that are actually working around it? In a number of cases, you can actually discover that a workaround is in place, not necessarily because a workaround needs to take place, but because the end users or the individuals that are participating aren't familiar enough with the correct workflow steps. So the second one, are they knowledgeable in that process? So if they're aware of the documented process steps that are in place, do they understand them, or are there gaps in the understanding area? Are there any gaps in the documentation that assume that something is occurring or assume that there's knowledge had by the participants that may not be there? And this really speaks to the level of detail that's present in the documented workflow and in that communication that we just talked about a minute ago. So the next question to ask is, why are they performing the workaround? So open and honest communication with a group of individuals that are actually performing a workaround for a documented flow can go a long way to understanding why it's actually taking place and whether or not it's something that needs to be addressed from a corrective action perspective or from a change management, we need to figure out a better way to do this perspective. So simply asking why the workaround is taking place can sometimes bring forward factors that weren't really considered by the IT department. So the next question is the workaround being used by a small group of people or an individual, or is it something that is widespread? So are all departments and all units actually using this workflow, or is it just a little pocket of people? So this can actually help you when you do finally get to the determination point, whether it's favorable or unfavorable, to understand what magnitude of change is going to be involved in actually making the workflow official or in correcting the workaround behavior. So another question that may tie into why they're doing things is whether or not the users that are participating in the workaround understand this as a temporary workaround or whether they're intending for this to be a long-term process change. Temporary workarounds might be in place because there's some sort of external factor that is impacting the way that they do their work. Those factors may be things that they're waiting on. So for example, if they've reported that a particular piece of equipment or a particular area is out of service and they have to put a workaround in place to address that, versus if they find the entire process doesn't work for them and they've implemented a workaround because they think it's going to be more efficient this way. Focusing a bit more on the IT side, one of the other questions that we need to ask, and this is not necessarily something that we ask of end users, but maybe something we ask from the internal IT departments, and that's whether or not the workaround is a single event workaround or whether it actually results in a cascading effect of workaround. So does the workaround that's taking place actually result in multiple subsequent workarounds having to be done? So for example, if someone is documenting order instructions in a comment field instead of in a discrete dropdown, then this often results in a cascade effect where the recipient of the order actually now needs to consider and look at a different spot. It can impact reports, it can impact the way you do your filters, and it sort of can cascade off of there. One of the other IT questions to ask is whether there is a single system that's involved or whether there are other systems that are actually going to get involved in this particular workaround. So if we look at the order example where some instructions were placed in the comment field, if that happens to be an integrated order, so a lab order, a diagnostic order, one that's being transmitted to a different department, we have to make sure that the other system is actually going to be able to adequately display or understand the information that's been entered. And so we've got a couple of different systems that are now in play here. So that's something important that we need to keep track of. So once you understand what the workaround is and why the workaround is being done, as well as where some of the impacts are, you're going to want to actually start to assess whether or not the workaround is something that you want to keep in place or not. So not all workarounds need to be thrown out or corrected. Some workarounds actually are innovative process and they can make things better. In order to fully assess whether this is the case, there's a few questions in this area that you'll want to ask. So first and foremost is whether or not the workaround results in process efficiency. So in a lot of instances, a workaround is actually in place because individuals or participants think that it's faster. One of the things you want to assess is whether or not that's actually the case. So the next thing to consider is whether or not the workaround is improving the patient care path or whether it's improving patient satisfaction. So if you have a workaround in place that's actually resulting in a benefit to the patient, this is something that you really need to take a look at. The third question to ask when assessing is, are there any policies or organizational guidelines that are actually in play with respect to this workaround or with respect to this workflow? So you want to make sure that any workarounds that are in place aren't actually circumventing any particular policies or guidelines or aren't resulting in some of the necessary documentation being missed. So this is another area where it's important for you to have documented workflows and to understand where the regulations and guidelines actually intersect with the process to discover whether or not there's impacts. So next up on the IT side, are there any technical issues that are created from the workaround? So are the actions that are being taken within the particular system that the workaround is present in actually resulting in any technical impacts? So an example that I can think of is cut-paste options. So if individuals are actually documenting outside of the system and cutting and pasting that material into a particular IT application, in some instances, if there's trailing characters, it can actually cause problems with integration. And the last one that you want to ask is whether or not the workaround actually aligns with your organizational goals and strategy. So if you're working towards things and you have a longer term transformation in mind, you want to make sure that you're keeping in mind whether or not these workarounds are in line with those long-term visions or if they're going to cause you issues along the way from a change management perspective. If after all of the questions and the review assessment is done, a workaround is determined to be unfavorable, meaning that it causes technical issues that cannot be overcome in a short period of time, or it leads to downstream impacts that may pose a risk to patient care or workflow efficiency, you're going to want to have conversations around how you can prevent that workaround from actually being done and to educate the users on the correct process flow that you would like them to use. If after you review the workaround you determine that it's favorable and it's something that you do want to continue, that's showing improvements in process efficiency or patient satisfaction, that there's no regulatory concerns and that there's no technical concerns in place, then you want to figure out how you can communicate this particular workaround as an alternative path or an alternative workflow, or in some cases a replacement workflow, and you'll also want to update any relevant documentation that you have. So that's all for this video. As always, if you like the types of videos I've been posting, feel free to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you're notified the next one I put one out. Have a great day.